Today we're going to learn about the bezel setting jewelry technique. You can see the essential question is, describe the most important parts of the bezel setting and why they are the most important. As always, you can use the Cornell notes to help you remember things for the safety and tools quiz that we'll be taking shortly, so it's always highly suggested that you take some notes. Our learning targets in the bezel setting unit are: I understand the tools and techniques and order of the bezel setting process in order to create a piece that is well crafted and shiny. I understand all safety protocols to protect my body and others during the bezel setting process, and I will use areas of texture and smooth as well as meeting the other requirements of the bezel piece. Bezel setting is technically a form of cold connection because you have to place the stone into your piece without heat. We will be using cabochon stones for this. What that means is that the top part of the stone is rounded and the bottom part of the stone is flat. If you think about how earthquakes happen, the heat under the crust of the earth makes the earth's crust, which is stone, crack. The same thing will happen to your stone if you have the cabochon stone in place when the piece is being soldered together. You also need to understand the Mohs hardness scale for bezel setting. We will be using stones that have a Mohs hardness of 8 or higher to ensure the success of your work. If you try setting something too soft as a beginning student, you will most likely scratch or break the stone. The tools needed for creating bezels are several types of mandrels. Here you can see bezel and ring mandrels, as well as bracelet mandrels. You will also have to use files, specifically the half-round file and a wire cutter, to create the bezel, which is the wire that holds the stone on your piece. Different types of hammers are needed as well. If you didn't already know this, the rawhide mallet is used for forming metal without creating lots of dents in the design. The chasing hammer will be used to stretch metal when you place it on the mandrels, as you just saw. In the final part of the bezel process, you'll need to use the bezel pusher or bezel rocker, whatever works best for you, to flatten the metal onto the stone to hold it in place permanently. You will also have to use the burnisher to rub the bezel to help make the bezel shiny at the end. This will be used, and then you will use the Dremel tool to finalize the shine very quickly, but remember, we are trying to eliminate excess heat so the stone doesn't crack. There are going to be 10 requirements of your bezel piece. Again, there is a link in the requirements title on the top of this page that will take you to the requirements page if you'd like to have that for easy reference later. The first requirement is you need at least 2 piercings. The second requirement is that it has to be structurally sound, so that's that 2 millimeters of space around each pierced shape. Requirement 3 is that the piece has to be layered with multiple metals or other materials and techniques used. Number 4 is use of at least one textural element. Number 5 is that you must have at least one formed piece that is not flat. Number 6 is it should be personally meaningful so that you really love what you're working on. Number 7 is you have to have fine craftsmanship, which means there are no problems or sloppy areas at the end. Number 8 is there needs to be one bezel set stone. Number 9 is that it has to be functional. Pendants and earrings must have a soldered bail. And number 10 is that it should have an appropriate finish, which means it's either shiny or has some form of patina or another colorant. Similar to our first project, there are pendant and earring shapes you can start with when designing your bezel piece. It's always a good idea to create at least 5 sketches so you understand what your piece will look like. You can color in different metals or the stones like this person did with colored pencil if you'd like to. You have to make sure that you also draw the piece to scale, especially if you are creating a ring. The drawing also has to be drawn flat because you are working with sheet metal, and the only way to understand how large the piece of metal needs to be is by drawing the entire design flat, like the upper right image on this page. As mentioned in the learning targets, one of the requirements of this assignment is having areas of texture and areas of smooth in the design. Here you can see the textural parts of the underbelly of the grasshopper that give the pin design additional interest and contrast in the lower side of the piece. The artist also did a really good job hiding the pin back as you cannot see it in this image. It's a great example of fine craftsmanship. We will go over how to texture soon, but for now you need to look at the image in the lower left part of this slide so you realize that you also need to figure out a way to represent the texture in your metal as you draw your sketches. You need to know where the texture will go, not necessarily what it will look like. In order to draw your work to scale, you will need to use your millimeter ruler. The millimeter ruler has ring shank and bracelet gauges on it to show you how large the piece needs to be for different sized pieces. This also means that you need to use a ring sizer in order to figure out what size a ring might be if you are making a ring. You will need to understand several soldering techniques for this assignment because you will have at least 2 or 3 solders to finish this piece, probably way more than that. Solder comes in a variety of melting temperatures, so we are able to solder the piece multiple times in order to get all the parts of the piece soldered together. As you create your sample solders, we will be using hard solder, so you really learn how soldering works. As you can see on this slide, there are many other connections you could create. This handout shows you several that you may want to use as you create your work. Additionally, there are different types of bales you could create to level up and set your piece apart from everyone else. Just like the first assignment, we'll be creating steps for the bezel piece. Once you have the piece designed, create your steps and check them with the instructor. He or she will help you if there are mistakes in your thinking, specifically in regards to when to use different types of solder. The point is to try to figure out the steps by yourself using these slides, which are numbers 26 and 27, and then writing out what you will complete and different parts of your design. You may want to type your slides in a Google Doc, as moving the steps is easier than handwriting them when they are out of order. Just so you are aware, you might be able to complete different steps while one step is in the pickle. Be creative so you can keep working and finish on time. The steps for the bezel setting can be varied depending on what you are planning to do, but generally you would start by wrapping the wire around the stone you are planning on using. We are going to start with very simple shapes, but you can see there are unusual shapes that may have to be shaped by hand eventually. When you prepare to solder the bezel, you will be preparing the ring the same way you did during your solder sample, but the piece will be much smaller than the first one you completed, so you have to make sure the flame is really small, probably only a ½ inch or less. Remember, the solder should be placed in the inner part of the bottom of the oval where you are trying to connect the piece. If you don't understand that right now, don't worry, once we start soldering, you will. Bezels have to be specific heights, and the type of design you are creating will make that height vary. This means that you need to select a thicker bezel wire if you are creating a ring, because you'll have to be filing part of it off when you file the bezel to match the curve in your ring. It does mean that bezels for rings are also a bit harder to do. As you can see, the bezel should be just over the curve in the stone, but if you are making a ring, that bezel also needs to fit the curve of the ring. The most important part of understanding bezels right now is that after soldering them, you have to check the fit of the stone. The stone should drop freely through the bezel without being pushed. To check the fit, you have to place the stone in the bezel to test it. If you put dental floss in the bezel cup, you can put the stone in the cup and pull it out if it gets stuck. Pulling the stone out with a heated wax wire will also work. We do have bezel mandrels in the classroom, which are helpful in stretching the bezel if it's slightly too small after soldering. Remember, the chasing hammer is what will stretch the metal. You also need to flip the bezel as you do so it doesn't become tapered like the mandrel. Once you stretch the bezel, you need to check the fit of the stone again. To solder the bezel down, flux both pieces. Then place the bezel on the piece and heat with a feathery flame until the flux bubbles up and the pieces don't move. Then take the solder with the tweezers and place the solder inside the bezel. You'll only need about 6 or 8 pieces of solder for that. Dry the flux again and heat the piece from underneath until the solder melts. We put the solder inside the bezel so there's less solder cleanup later. This particular piece was a bezel cup that the person was going to cut or file the edges off of, but sometimes the bezel is actually on your finished piece, which is why you would always want to solder it this way. Once you've soldered the bezel to the piece, you can start finishing your work. You really should go all the way to buffing without doing anything to the bezel, so there is enough metal to work with when you set the stone. Once your piece is completely buffed and shiny, you'll need to put 2 layers of blue tape on it to protect it as you are using tools to set the stone. You can then take a file and file the bezel so it's the appropriate size, just over the curve of the stone, and paper thin so it can be pushed over the stone with ease. You can also use epoxy or glue to set the stone in place, but this is less professional, so only use this if it's a last resort. If something happened to your bezel and it became too short to hold the stone down. When you set the stone, you should go in opposite sides like a cross-like pattern. See the numbers on the diagram on this slide so you understand what I mean. You can use either the bezel rocker or the bezel pusher to do this. Either way, you would continue to push down the bezel until there are no gaps evident between the stone and the metal of the bezel. You would then take a burnisher to rub the edge of the metal closest to the stone to make it shiny. You can also use liver of sulfur or a silver blackener to create more contrast in areas of your piece, especially where the texture has been created. Remember that you should be taking process photos during each day you work on the bezels, and you should be updating your digital portfolio as we move along. At this point, we will talk about the bezel examples and you'll have some time to work on your design. We will soon go over the annealing and texturing process, as well as the soldering process. You will have to follow the soldering schedule, meaning you'll have to take a break from the bezel design process and your texturing piece during studio time in order to solder. Don't worry. The teacher will devise a schedule that will allow you to solder and get the bezel sketches done so everyone will continue working and obtain credit at the same time. As long as you continue working on either soldering or your bezel piece each day, you should finish on time. If you're still worried about it, I encourage you to come in for enrichment periods so you'll have additional time to work.